I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Amber Duke.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So today we got plenty of news to talk about. I'll be kicking it off, talking about the latest news in Israel and Gaza and the end of the ceasefire with Hamas. Then Ben is going to be talking about the anti-Israel, pro-Iran faction in the Biden administration and what they've been up to. Inez is going to talk about the latest bloviating, I guess, from the Atlantic and other outlets about Donald Trump potentially becoming president again, and they're framing him as a dictator. And finally, Amber is going to be taking a look at what Disney was doing with the special district in Reedy Creek and the kind of benefits that they were just throwing about, and tax evasion and all sorts of nonsense that they were doing. That's plenty newsworthy there. But so we'll get started. Obviously, what seems to remain at the top of the news cycle is what's going on in Israel and in Gaza. So since our last podcast, the ceasefire has ended. It's been ended for at least, I don't remember exactly how many days, but for a while now, at least 4 or 5 days. Israel is back at operating in Gaza. They're no longer operating in just the north part of the Gaza Strip. They're also operating in the south in order to preserve civilian casualties. They've created a detailed map and alert system to alert any people in any very specific individual sector of the Gaza Strip that they need to leave. They're continuing to find what they've been finding throughout the war, which is Hamas operating out of civilian facilities. There was a video they put out just, I think, today or yesterday on the IDF webpage showing that they're operating out of schools, that they're having spotters everywhere, tons of ammunition and infrastructure all over the civilian parts of the southern Gaza Strip as well. There's also been some reporting that major figures in Hamas who have been hiding out in Khan Yunis were injured in strikes and were taken to the hospital. That was something that popped up yesterday as well. But there are two sort of other major issues that have arisen out of the Israel war that have been the topic of a lot of discussion. The first is the attacks on naval vessels going on in the Red Sea. Attacks on commercial shipping that somehow is an attachment to Israel by the Houthis, and what looks like it almost was a hit on an American destroyer in the Red Sea by the Houthis in Yemen. Now, it's a pretty remarkable escalation. The Houthis are obviously part of the constellation of proxies funded by Iran. They basically have control of a large chunk of Yemen, including the capital, and they have declared war on Israel and have sent a few missiles. It's surprising because if you look geographically, Yemen is quite a long way from Israel. They're already all the way at the very southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, and them being able to they can't send land forces in any meaningful way. Saudi Arabia is completely in the way, and it's a massive distance from Yemen to Israel itself, but that hasn't stopped them from sending cruise missiles. And also because the Red Sea is where Israeli shipping has to go through in order to reach Asia and Africa. That's obviously a major problem in the sense that it opens up their shipping to missile attacks and drone attacks, which apparently the Houthis are doing. The fact that the Houthis have hit a United States ship, I think, should be a much bigger deal than it is. I am a person that is definitely for restraint for the Americans for foreign policy, but I'm also not a person willing to tolerate random nations shooting missiles at our Navy. That shouldn't be tolerated, and there needs to be a response. And so far as I've seen, the Biden administration has yet to respond to our naval soldiers being attacked. And it's a similar thing where they've been very, very reticent to respond to proxies attacking our bases in Iraq and in Syria. Now, query whether or not we should have those bases in Iraq and in Syria, and query further whether we should have them if we're not willing to defend our troops. I think the fundamental question is, if we're going to have troops sitting in Syria and Iraq, we can't just have a world where we're letting them be subject to, kamikaze drone attack without doing something about it. There needs to be meaningful deterrence. Otherwise, those people need to be pulled out immediately. And as for our Navy, there's no way we should be tolerating any restrictions on our freedom of shipping or our freedom of transit through the Red Sea. So I'm hoping that the Houthis pay some sort of price for this. I hope that it doesn't lead to a full-scale war, but I'm certainly not willing to set a precedent where you can just launch kamikaze drones at our troops and nothing happens. The second big major debate kind of resulting out of Israel-Hamas stuff is essentially this kind of denial of the claims of sexual violence. I mean, we've seen Brianna Joy from Rising and even UN officials. I mean, UN finally acknowledged that there had been sexual violence, but you're still seeing a lot of denial about it on Twitter. It's really remarkable. I mean, there are people suggesting that they should have taken the time to take rape kits in the aftermath of October 7th, when 1,200 people were died and the morgues were overflowing. There's plenty of testimonial and film evidence that strongly suggests that there was sexual violence used. It's also bizarre that people would be making, this aggressive claim about, well, Hamas did kidnap toddlers and elderly people, but they, sexual violence, you have no evidence of that. I mean, if they're willing to do one, I don't really feel like it's that much of a stretch to suggest they're doing the other, nor is it that much of an apology or that effective an apology for Hamas to suggest they're not engaged in sexual violence. But I think, what's the final point I wanted to make here? The other major point is there's a reason that one of the big sticking points and the reason that the ceasefire ended in the first place was that Hamas wasn't willing to hand over a certain number of women that it had been holding hostage, and almost all of those women were of childbearing age. And the theory that the American State Department put out, as well as the Israelis have put out, is that they don't want those women talking about what they experienced in captivity. And it seems kind of obvious that that's what's happening here. So it's very bizarre that people are trying to deny this. It's really repugnant, actually. And it's just it's yet another indication of how far people are willing to go to defend a truly noxious terrorist organization because of prior intellectual commitments to the Palestinian cause. Anyway, that's plenty on Israel-Hamas, so I'll leave it there for everybody else to talk.
I only have a couple points. One on reestablishing deterrence, which is also something obviously that Israel needs to do after this attack. Freedom of the seas is the most basic sort of commitment of a powerful USA. It's one that we inherited from the British Empire. They, before them, the Dutch. The ability to ship freely on across trading lanes on the seas is, even if one has a very minimalistic conception of what the United States should do in the world, that ought to be part of it, and it has been part of the American commitment for a very, very long time. So just to underscore how basic that those kinds of commitments are. And then on the Me Too stuff, I feel like a broken record, obviously, saying this. I know that everyone on this podcast has said this and knows this, but with the tip of the hat to Orrin McIntyre, it's not hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. The reason that they care about 30-year-old allegations against, Brett Kavanaugh with not a shred of either direct or circumstantial evidence. The reason that those are enough to torpedo the career of a Republican-nominated Supreme Court justice, but women walking around with bloodied pants and the direct eyewitness statements and film are not enough to obviously declare that Hamas used rape as a weapon of war in October 7th. That's because there are favored and disfavored groups. There are favored and disfavored women in this case. And some of their stories will be elevated insofar as they, advance the narrative and hit the enemies. And the stories that do the reverse, that undermine the narrative, sad to say that hit allies, as Hamas is clearly seen as an ally for certain parts of the left in the United States. Those stories, even no matter how factually sort of backed up, and what level of evidence, those stories will be ignored. And that's not because they're hypocrites. It's because it's a friend-enemy distinction.
I saw those social media posts early this morning from people denying that rape happened on October 7th or in the aftermath. And I was equally as disturbed, I think, as all of you to see that. And what was amazing to me about it was the constant moving of the goalposts, right? Because they would start with this idea, oh, well, there's no eyewitness accounts or there's no direct evidence that there were rapes. And then when you point out the eyewitness accounts, it's, well, those are from men. So clearly they were coached by the IDF. And then when you find that there's women, they say, oh, well, they could have equally been coached, or they were just confused in the fog of what was happening that day. And you sent a Washington Post article where they describe the seminars that they've been having with victims of October 7th, female victims, and how to rise above what happened to them. And it doesn't matter. They deny all of it. They're not interested in acknowledging any of the evidence because it cuts against their idea that Hamas are the freedom fighters, that they are trying to lift Palestinians from oppression. It couldn't possibly be that they are actively subjugating other people. And the cognitive dissonance, whether intentional or unintentional, is just beyond on this story. It's truly hard to wrap your head around.
One, I think the cognitive dissonance itself, I think, reflects just how clarifying a time this is and how clarifying an event October 7th was in terms of the left in the West, and I guess to some extent the West more broadly. They are denying what's right before their eyes in the ultimate in terms of savagery and barbarism, and just asking questions just reveals how ultimately morally bankrupt and fraudulent many are on the left when it comes to their purported devotion to civil rights, caring about minorities and such. Let's not forget the entire framing of this so-called conflict is that somehow Israel is this genocidal power in the Middle East that overwhelms all of its enemies, when in fact we're talking about a New Jersey-sized state with millions of people in an ocean of hundreds of millions of people who overwhelmingly hate Israel, and again over time have sought to see it destroyed, have cleansed their own, ethnically cleansed their own nations of Jews, creating hundreds of thousands of refugees in the 1940s. No reparations, by the way. There isn't some refugee agency for Jews who were kicked out of Muslim majority countries throughout the region. So the entire argument, the entire paradigm at play here is a joke. It's a fraudulent joke. The colonializing powers there and the bigoted powers and the ones who have a real conflict between religious states and democracy are all of Israel's enemies in the region. And of course, the pathologies that dominate among Hamas and Palestinian Arabs in Judea and Samaria as well represent the height of, the worst of, the apex of the savagery and barbarism that prevails. So the whole framing of the conflict itself from the left is a fraudulent one. And I think you see it in microcosm when it comes to the obvious sexual assaults. And then, of course, beyond that, the mutilation of individuals, the taking of hostages, the savage torture of those hostages and beyond. All of it exposes the utter moral bankruptcy that's at play here. I'm going to transition a little bit here because much of what Will talked about, I kind of wanted to hit on and I can draw a line to. So in my segment, I guess I'll talk a bit about the personnel in the Biden administration and the policy that flows from the Biden administration. And my argument would be that you can see in the non-deterrence of Iran and its proxies in the Middle East, the poisonous fruits of the Biden administration policy, which, as I've argued before, is to impose a maximum pressure campaign, not on Iran, the world's leading state sponsor of jihad and its proxies, but on Israel as the chief provocateur and irritant and chief stumbling block to peace in the Middle East, and to return to the Obama-Biden administration policy of making Iran and its proxies the strong course in the region. So I see America's policy towards Israel, which, by the way, in Will's comprehensive segment, we couldn't even get to the fact that, and I'll quote here, a transcript from Tony Blinken talking with his Israeli counterparts just about a week ago before we filmed this. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant in Israel says, the entire Israeli society is united behind the goal of dismantling Hamas, even if it takes months. Blinken's response is, I don't think you have credit for that. And this is in context of the Biden administration's attempt to micromanage and hem in and govern and dictate to Israel its policy to defend itself, specifically with respect to Hamas and Gaza, and then to also try to predictate the terms of a peace after Hamas is eliminated and impose essentially a Palestinian Arab state with Gaza and Judea and Samaria ruled by the Palestinian Authority, which overwhelmingly has the same worldview as Hamas and supported the atrocities on October 7th. All of this is part and parcel of the Biden administration, but really the Obama-Biden administration continuation of a policy of aiding, abetting, and enabling Iran. And we've talked before about this, but part of it is the de-designation of the Houthis as a terrorist organization in an early move of the Biden administration. It's the fact that there's no deterrence in the dozens of attacks on U.S. forces in just recent weeks, as well as these commercial vessels, which has been met with almost nothing but cosmetic responses, essentially, by the Biden administration, as opposed to, say, anything even remotely close to assassinating the likes of a Qasem Soleimani. The non-enforcement of sanctions, the unfreezing of billions of dollars to Iran, the pursuit to the nth degree of an Iran deal 2.0, the essentially aiding and abetting and enabling of so-called security forces in Lebanon, which is really a proxy for Hezbollah, preventing Israel from striking at Hezbollah and other proxies as well. So you put all the policies together, and our troops are sitting ducks in the Middle East. And I think we're headed towards a very, very potentially a Benghazi 2.0, whether it's an attack on our troops or attack on our diplomatic facilities throughout the region by Iran and its proxies. Obviously, you could have a massive economic crisis when it comes to skirmishes and attacks in strategically significant, economically important shipping lanes, whether it's in the Red Sea, like the recent attacks, or the Straits of Hormuz, which Iran wishes to dominate. And then you have to ask the question, why is this the policy? And I wrote about in the New York Post sort of a thumbnail sketch of all the Biden administration officials in senior officials within the CIA, within the State Department, within NSC, in intelligence within NSC, all of whom have shown sympathies towards the Palestinian Arabs, against Israel overtly, in some cases who appear to have been compromised by the Iranians. So to quickly tick them off, Amy McFadden at CIA is one of the top 3 people responsible for the dissemination, overseeing the dissemination of all intelligence within CIA. Someone who oversaw the creation of the president's daily brief for some time. Within 2 weeks after October 7th, she reportedly put up on her Facebook profile a picture of essentially Palestinian Arab propaganda, a keffiyeh-clad, T-shirt-wearing Palestinian Arab waving a Palestinian flag in a clear nod to and support for quote-unquote Palestinian resistance. This is a person who's a top 3 person at CIA in the dissemination of all intelligence across CIA. I think we've talked before about Rob Malley, the chief negotiator in Iran Deal 1.0, who was brought in by the Biden administration to do Iran Deal 2.0. Rob Malley himself had a security clearance suspended, is under FBI investigation for mishandling of classified documents. He had ties to Hamas, spoke with Hamas leaders, which got him sidelined from the Barack Obama presidential campaign way back when in 2008. He brought in a woman named Ariane Tabatabai to work under his office as special envoy to Iran, negotiating Iran Deal 2.0. Tabatabai herself has been implicated as an asset in an Iranian regime-led intelligence influence operation. She apparently had communications with Iranian officials who sort of coached her and led her messaging before she testified before Congress previously. Tabatabai herself then moved from under Malley's employ to DOD, where she works as chief of staff for a high-ranking official responsible for special operations at DOD, and apparently now has become a Navy Reserve intelligence officer. She has not had her security clearance revoked despite all of these revelations about her ties, supposedly is under investigation, but continues serving in office at a high-level position at DOD. Then there's Mar Bitar, who is the senior director for intelligence programs at NSC. So essentially one of the top intelligence officials at NSC, overseeing, coordinating other agencies, intelligence agencies, and reporting directly to the president at NSC, a pivotal national security office. Bitar himself has long had ties to Students for Justice in Palestine, which have been kicked off many campuses for Hamas sympathy. He was a leader in the BDS movement when he was at Georgetown, has been tied to and supported essentially a whole litany of statements or crafted some statements demonizing Israel. And the list goes on down to the struggle session folks who are writing dissent cables at the State Department and elsewhere demanding a ceasefire, etc. You can draw a direct link from the personnel to the policy that we're seeing, which, as I've described, is empower Iran, put the screws to Israel. We're seeing that play out in U.S. policy towards the Israel-Hamas war, but we're also seeing it in the non-deterrence of Iran. It's going to get Americans killed. And so the question at the end is, what are Republicans doing in the face of this? And thus far, it's basically been tersely worded letters, but there has to be a change in policy, I would argue, from the perspective of American national interest, or Americans are going to get killed as a consequence of these policies. With that, I put it out to the group. I've laid out a lot here, obviously. Anything you want to expound upon or otherwise comment on?
Sure, real quick. The Blinken line, I didn't mention that earlier. I forgot about it. It's a really remarkable gall for him to say that Israel doesn't have the credit to do something. But I think, honestly, the reality is exactly the inverse. You know, after something like October 7th, the Biden administration doesn't have the credit with Israel or the Israelis to get them to change their policy. I've seen a lot, there's a lot of polling and suggestions that the American Muslim community is going to stay home out of protest at how President Biden has handled this. I mean, it's I'm a fan of that because great, stay home, don't vote Democrat, fine. But it's delusional in two respects. The first respect is that they'd ever get Biden to go along with like a full, revocation of support in Israel. And the second respect at which it's delusional is to think that that would have any effect on Israeli policy whatsoever after October 7th in any event.
Couple points. One, as insane as what Ben laid out just now is at the top levels and having actual spies. I mean, this permeates the entire sort of intelligence apparatus going forward, right? I don't know if you guys remember, right after October 7th, there was a story in the Daily Wire by Luke Rosiak detailing how DHS had hired to vet incoming asylum seekers from Muslim countries, had hired the former PLO spokesperson from a delegation that Trump had expelled from the country. So DHS hired her after Trump expelled that delegation. So it's not something that stops with a few top-level people. This is sort of permeating the American administrative state, in particular the intelligence state. And again, to harken back to the previous segment, in many ways, this has been very clarifying because it allows us to see at least the tip of the iceberg in terms of the types of people who run America's security state. And then finally, really briefly, I just want to say, I think part of the Blinken statements and the sort of back and forth of the Biden administration on this does demonstrate a split between Biden and Obama. We've talked in previous podcasts about how Obama has been running a type of, not to be too conspiratorial about it, but a type of shadow government. He still has very close relationships with a lot of top level officials, including cabinet officials. And he stayed in DC, which has been historically unusual for a former president. And there's no doubt that he has a very strong hand in sort of influencing the Biden administration at minimum. I think this does demonstrate somewhat of a break. This may be the first major way in which the Biden administration has broken very hard with the former Obama administration, which, of course, Obama was probably the most anti-Israel president that we have had in modern times since the creation of the State of Israel. Anyway, I think that's an interesting thing to note, that this is Amber's cat is joining the conversation. But yes, I think that's an interesting thing to note, that there is this break between Biden and Obama here. I think that is probably very relevant behind the scenes.
All right. Well, with a brief interlude of Amber's cat there, I think we're gonna, Amber asked that we move on, so we're moving on here. The next topic is Inez. Right back to you, discussing the way that the Atlantic completely lost their composure over the potential of Trump becoming president again.
I don't think that it's generally that worthwhile to comb through the pages of the Washington Post or the Atlantic to try to understand the shape of the world today. But sometimes they tell you exactly what they're thinking. And there does seem to be a coordinated push across multiple left-leaning outlets, Washington Post, New York Times, the Atlantic, to start framing Trump as the potential an incoming dictator. And in doing so, I think it's worth pointing out what they've listed, but these are the kind of headlines that have been popping up in the last week. The Atlantic did an entire magazine based around the ominous phrase, "if Trump wins." The New York Times put out an article why a second Trump presidency may be more radical than his first. The Washington Post put out multiple articles about this, but with headlines like "Trump dictatorship looks, quote, increasingly inevitable." And essentially what's listed in a lot of these articles, hilariously enough, I mean, I don't like, generally speaking, the theories of projection. I think there are sort of pop psychology theories to explain political behavior. I think it's sort of overused. But in this case, it's hard to avoid the sense that this is projection. What is written in a lot of these sort of fantasy pieces about what a Trump dictatorship might look like looks an awful lot like what the left has been doing to the right and Trump for the last 8 to 10 years. Just some specific examples. They're worried that some of the people high-ranking in the military and in the intelligence state may be charged with crimes, for example, or investigated either by the Justice Department or by being subpoenaed to Congress. And Milley, for example, is mentioned as someone who this might happen to. Well, that sounds awfully familiar. They are worried that Trump might weaponize the justice system. That's a hilarious one. Particularly, the Washington Post wrote that calling Biden pro-China or Beijing Joe, and they point to a bunch of congressmen and women of the Republican Party saying things along these lines. They say that this is setting up the kind of illegitimacy of Joe Biden when they spent 4 years pushing the idea that Donald Trump was literally a Manchurian candidate for Vladimir Putin in Russia. They worry that Trump appointees in the federal government will do his bidding without being asked. Maybe that's what the administrative state has done for the center left for really the last 100 years, but certainly the last 20. They're worried generally that the bureaucracy, which the Washington Post calls a check on the power of the presidency, that's kind of saying the quiet part out loud. The unelected bureaucracy is not supposed to be a check on the power of the president. It's supposed to be, in fact, his executive branch carrying out his political directives. But they worry that check might disappear if the civil service rules are changed. From the Washington Post's lips to God's ears, I guess, on that one. And then finally, this ridiculous phrase that reminds strongly of the "our democracy" farce, which is quote, ominous. You understand? Votes are the currency of power in our system. That's supposed to be ominous. The fact that Trump has a voting base, an enthusiastic voting base who is willing to vote for him both in the primary and potentially vote him back into the presidency. Look, there's a little bit of sort of enjoyment in this, obviously, at least on my part, reading this list of potential evils that the left has actually done to the right in the last several years. That being said, I think it's worth, I'm throwing it out to the group to speculate or add anything of what you think. What is the point of this coordinated attack? Is this going to be sort of the line that the Joe Biden campaign takes largely in lieu of being able to run on his record? Is this sort of some people have gone so far, like Matt Gaetz has gone so far as to suggest this is greenlighting assassination of Donald Trump. But anyway, we have the return to this drumbeat of Donald Trump is Hitler, Donald Trump is a dictator, and setting up the illegitimacy of many of the things that they're describing are actually the reassertion of democracy and capital P politics against a system that has hardened itself against any kind of actual input or backlash from the American people. In a sense, these pieces are calling democracy itself illegitimate and a danger to democracy. So, what's the purpose? This is obviously coordinated. It's all come out in the last week. So why do you think all of a sudden we've returned to the discussion of Donald Trump as potential dictator?
I think it's 100% a political strategy heading into 2024. They did a very similar thing in 2016 and then again in 2020. In 2016, I went back and read some of the articles after these new ones started dropping about why Trump was supposedly a dictator then. And it was because he wanted to deport people and because he supported a travel ban from some majority Muslim countries. And then in 2020, the whole purpose of Biden's campaign was to position himself as the return to normalcy candidate against this sort of dark MAGA extremism. And now in 2024, they're starting to return to that kind of rhetoric. And Biden obviously doesn't want to run on his record anymore. They started to shift away now from Bidenomics, which was a term that they coined, by the way, and are now talking about extreme MAGAnomics. That's the new term coming out of the White House and the Biden campaign. And to your point about how so many of these accusations in these articles are admissions, they really zeroed in on that speech Trump gave a little while ago where he referred to the radical left that needs to be rooted out like vermin from the United States. And then you go and you read Biden's comments about Republicans, and he talks about MAGA being the most extreme political organization in modern history that threatens the very foundation of our republic. And just the comparison is quite obvious there in terms of just the rhetoric. But what I found really fascinating in this New York Times article in particular, which is of course headed up by their heavy hitters, Jonathan Swan, Haberman, they say that really nothing has changed significantly in the sense of what Trump wants to do politically. But the real fear is that he would be more effective this time around because he has more personnel opportunities. He has more political capital. He maybe has better inroads with the Republican machine. And so he would actually be able to accomplish the things that he warned about in 2016, which speaks to perhaps more a fear of effectiveness than actual a change in policy or a sense of getting more radical. But this being a strategy seems really rope-a-dope because when you look at the recent polls that have come out talking about what the state of the races in swing states in particular, you have a Bloomberg poll that found only 8% of voters said democracy was their top issue. And I actually hate when polls even ask that anyway, because like, what does democracy mean? If you're not defining that term for voters, they could take it to mean what the left means when they say democracy, which is, again, that Trump is a dictator and we have to save the country. But I'm sure that there are plenty of people on the right who would read democracy and think that what the left is doing is a threat to democracy. So I don't think it's a very informative poll question to ask, like, is democracy your top issue? But that being said, it basically came in third or fourth place among voters behind economy and immigration, which I think 50% of voters peg as their top issue. And on the democracy issue, Biden only has a 3-point advantage on who voters trust more to handle it when you look at a New York Times Siena poll. So you have Trump running away by double digits on the issues that really matter to voters, like economy and immigration. And then Biden only has a 3-point advantage on democracy. And then the other big Democratic issue, of course, is abortion. He only has a 4-point advantage on who voters trust more. So I don't know if it's just they don't have anything else that they can kind of develop as a wedge issue. But to use democracy as their calling card, this idea that Trump is a dictator, the numbers just aren't there for that to be a winning issue for the Democrats.
Yeah. I'll go ahead here. I read the cover sheet of that Atlantic article, and I couldn't help but think, if any of this were true, if only he were capable of doing any of these things, things would be much better. And disclaimer, obviously, I work for Governor DeSantis, both on his campaign and in his executive office. But, if only he was, that effective at hiring people, if only he was capable of the focus and long-term, thinking and dedication in order to revamp the entire bureaucracy, if only he could prevent the bureaucracy from checking him, because his first 4 years, he didn't do any of that. He was an excellent foreign policy president. Don't get me wrong. Our foreign policy was much better, but the bureaucracy had him swamped by the end of 2017 and ruined his entire presidency. And he's going to have an extraordinarily difficult time hiring quality people now because of the way he treated almost everybody he hired in the first 4 years. And in reality, also, this is another point. He's going to be a 78-year-old president. People start slowing down. You can see it. His energy level is lower. I don't see this happening. And so it's sort of ironic in a funny way that the Democrats are threatening the idea that this guy's going to be a dictator. He's going to be a lame duck on day one if he wins. And his ability to actually move the bureaucracy to get people within the executive branch to do what he wants, I think is going to be substantially less, both because of the fact that he's a lame duck and also because I think it'll be very challenging for him to hire effectively and staff up the federal government after the problems in his first term. Remember, a whole bunch of his employees went bankrupt due to legal fees. He's not very good at keeping his people safe from this sort of thing.
Well, just on that little coda, one of the problems when it comes to staffing and administration that actually does threaten to take on regime power is that you have the threat of you're going to be litigated into bankruptcy. If you're a lawyer, you're going to be disbarred. They're going to smear your reputation, go after your family. Part of this pre-delegitimization effort, which has been ongoing for 8 years now, basically, is they probably want to scare people out of potentially going in, knowing the onslaught that would befall them should they consider going in. Obviously agree with all points about the projection at play here. If they're accusing Trump or Republicans of it, they're not only doing what they're accusing Republicans of, but probably 10 times worse. And also, obviously, the euphemism of democracy, like it's used by socialist or communist powers. Democracy means a regime monopoly on power exerted or imposed via tyranny if needed. And their definition of authoritarianism, of course, is actual Republican government. And I think that tells you all you need to know about the pseudo elites running our country. It's clear that probably the most salient message that they're putting forth, just like with harping on January 6th, is that our opponents are not only evil, but they're Nazis and domestic terrorists. I don't know if that washes with the American people or if that's about justifying the tyranny that we're about to see over the next year. But I do think this serves as a warning. Obviously, there's the potential incitement to violence aspect of this, ironically, from the people who talk about Republicans inciting violence, absurdly, given that the left has pretty much had a monopoly on political violence in this country for decades. And of course, in 2020, with the summer riots going into the election. But also, it would seem to me that they're trying to justify what's to come, which I think is going to be beyond just regime dirty tricks, but to a whole litany of disgusting and dangerous displays that we're about to see over the next year, to the extent they think they really could lose in 2024. And that's the censorship regime, that's lawfare, that's street violence, as Chris Rufo has written about recently. But I think it's going to go beyond that as well. And we should anticipate some of the most nefarious and disgusting attempts to hold on to power, ironically, from the people who say that Trump, were he to win again, will try to make himself king for life.
And with that, we'll transition over to Amber for the final topic, which is the revelations about Disney's empire in Reedy Creek.
Absolutely. It's been almost a year now since Governor Ron DeSantis signed legislation dissolving Reedy Creek, which is the special district created, or the special governance board, essentially, that oversees the special district that Disney resides in Orlando, Florida, in Central Florida. And a little bit of history here is important because Reedy Creek was established because Disney sold the Florida government on the idea that it was going to create the city of the future. That was the whole purpose of Epcot. If you're familiar with Disney World, you know that Epcot is now just another theme park as part of their conglomeration of various parks. But back in the 1960s, they had this whole plan where Disney employees would both live and work on campus. They would have affordable housing. They would have fire and police departments, all kinds of social services. And so they needed their own special government outside of the Florida government, outside of the state government, that would allow them to create this sort of booming infrastructure and new community for its employees. Because that never came to pass, Disney essentially ended up using Reedy Creek as its own government in order to maximize its corporate profits. It's one of the most amazing cases of corporate cronyism in modern history. There's an audit that came out yesterday, or on Monday rather, of this week, that really details the lengths that Disney went to get Reedy Creek in its pocket. Because Reedy Creek is functionally supposed to be separate from Disney. It's supposed to be run independently. Obviously, the whole idea that a special government governing board set up to oversee basically one corporation's land would have been independent in the first place is pretty silly. But because Disney never developed this housing community that they were talking about, things got really bad really quickly. So one of the items in the original legislation establishing Reedy Creek said that, one, the taxpayers in the special district would choose who sits on the Reedy Creek board because they would get 1 vote per 1 acre of land owned. And there are other taxpayers in the district. There are about 57 other businesses besides Disney, as well as businesses that lease land or property from Disney and pay taxes through them. But obviously, Disney holds the vast majority of land, so they basically single-handedly choose who gets to sit on the Reedy Creek board. And then there's another clause that says board members have to be landowners in order to serve, which would have been fine, again, if there were houses for them to live on Disneyland and they had developed this community. But because they didn't, Disney gets to basically hand over a parcel of land to their hand-selected board candidate, and they can choose who gets to serve that way as well, because they are in control of basically all the land in this special district. So Disney has this hand-picked board of individuals who are under the impression that they're basically an extension of Disney. And in order to cement that fact, Disney gives millions of dollars in these very valuable park passes to not just the board members and employees of Reedy Creek, but also to their family members, to their friends. They give them 40% discounts on cruises, massive discounts on food and drink and merchandise, to give the impression that Reedy Creek is there to only serve the interests of Disney, because Reedy Creek is basically an employee of Disney, because those benefits would typically be reserved for Disney employees. So over the years, Disney was able to skirt around all kinds of regulations when it comes to zoning law and development. They were able to avoid impact fees, which would be taxes paid to the Florida government to basically offset negative externalities from construction and development. That was to the tune of probably $200+ million that Disney was able to get out of paying impact fees. And the result is that Florida taxpayers and Florida small businesses suffered, because over the years, Disney basically created a monopoly over this massive piece of land in Central Florida. And the idea that Disney was going to bring a huge economic boom to the surrounding area is true in the sense that they have 100,000 employees who now live in the area. But at the same time, they've also put the burden of housing those people, providing social services to those people, the traffic that comes from them commuting to Disney every day, on the surrounding communities, and created all of those negative externalities. And there's a ton of more shocking things in this audit, from how Disney was running its own police and fire departments, and how Disney was able to get Reedy Creek to pay for development of projects that only benefited Disney, like spending $700 million in public funds to build parking garages that only Disney was allowed to use. And so the audit basically concludes that Governor DeSantis was 100% correct to take action to dissolve this special governing board and replace it with his own, because the level of corruption was just so insane that Disney had been using this as its personal piggy bank for half a century.
Look, I mean, I think it's long past due to ask for Republicans in basically every red state and governors in every red state to make corporations choose. Do they want a favorable business climate that they've found in red states, or do they want their leftist politics? It's a completely fair and small d democratic question to ask. if they want to continue to weigh in essentially as the enemies of the right, then they cannot expect special favors from the Republican Party, from red states, whether those favors amount merely to favorable business climate in comparison to blue states, or as Amber just in such a detailed way just laid out, I mean, truly special favors for particular corporations, something that Texas is also famous for, by the way. So is Georgia with regard to Delta. A lot of these major corporations have very special sweetheart deals in specific, usually red states, that exempt them from the normal taxes, allow them in this case to basically create their own municipal government, right? All of these things, and it's a completely fair question to make them choose. One sort of strategic element of all of this, I think it's really important that the red states start to seriously work together on this. Florida has been able to push back against this, not only because of, as I'm sure Will is about to point out, the excellent leadership of Governor DeSantis and his ability to execute on something that Republicans have traditionally not been able to do, but also because it's a big state with a vibrant and diverse economy. If we look at how, for example, Governor Nome in South Dakota dealt with this, different contexts, different sort of political issues, but nevertheless dealt with the biggest corporation in the state, which is the healthcare corporation. She bent the knee at every level to making sure that this corporation was happy to keep all of its business in South Dakota. And that's, in part because she's a more craven politician than Governor DeSantis and less effective. And that's completely a fair political critique. But it's also true that South Dakota is a small state, that this corporation had a chokehold on their economy and had the ability to really damage South Dakota's economy if they wanted to, which is why I think it's really important for the red states to start working as one in this and truly force that choice upon corporations. The choice is not, weigh in on your leftist politics, and you might have to leave this one state with an effective right-wing governor to go to another red state with a similarly low tax rate. The choice really must be, do you want to live in California under California regulations and California taxes, or New York, or substitute whatever large blue state you're thinking of, right? Either you live in the world created by your allies and the people that you're politically supporting, or you live in our world with lower taxes, lower regulations, but you give up your leftist politics. And in order to really force that choice, red states are going to have to work together. Right now, the only successful states, also because of political leadership, but we would be foolish to underestimate the reason that they've been able to be somewhat successful, Texas and Florida, is because they're big states with big populations, big markets, and diversified economies. And so red states, who I think will be much more effective as a whole if they work together on this than they will be, especially the smaller states will be separately.
Yeah, well, I think, obviously, big thank you to my old boss, Governor DeSantis, on this one. It's really like one of the remarkable things he was able to do. And it's a big distinction between him and a candidate like Nikki Haley, who when this was all going on, was going on news networks and talking about how she was going to try and bring Disney to South Carolina. I'm tired of Republican politicians simping for corporations that act adversely to the interests of Republican voters. And all the talk from the libertarian think tanks about how dare Governor DeSantis do this. I mean, this should put an end to that. This was an incredibly corrupt crony capitalism at its absolute worst. The corporation completely taking over the government and using it as an instrument of its will. Very, very obnoxious. So really glad that my old boss put an end to this nonsense. And Disney deserves it. I mean, not just for this, but for the terrible content it's been putting out.
Well, first, great reporting from Amber on this. Obviously, this is a microcosm of broader issues of crony capitalism, corporatism. I also think that, and I've argued this before, that we ought to start thinking of most big corporations as essentially extensions of the administrative state. And so it would be natural that an extension of the administrative state would then essentially rule over the territory that it's kind of been gifted, essentially, with all of these special favors that we're talking about. It seems like a bare minimum standard for red states should be attract businesses and work to foster the settling of businesses within your state that actually hold the same values that your citizens hold dear. Don't privilege your ideological enemies and your political enemies. In fact, ultimately, that's a basic standard, sort of along the lines of what our standard should be on a foreign policy of do no harm. There should be a do no harm principle within states as well. Don't privilege your political and ideological foes. And again, I think starting from the paradigm of big corporations have the same ideology as the regime, they are granted special privileges and work hand in hand, essentially, with the regime. They are extensions of the administrative state in practice. That's the way we ought to be thinking about them. And once you think about them that way, then you can get towards how do you then change their behavior and actually change the corporate world. So the corporate world is not averse to us, but it actually does what it's supposed to do, which is to make better goods and services at lower prices, create jobs, and allow for a dynamic and flourishing economy, and not try to impose left-wing ideology on workers and ultimately the country.
Okay, we'll go around the room and do final thoughts. I guess I'll kick it off. I am seeing a trend on Twitter about dinks, double income, no kids couples, and they're publishing weird little videos about their lives and how relieved they are not to have any obligations imposed on them by childcare and the ability to just do whatever it is they want. One of these videos actually showed them waking up at 8 a.m. on a Saturday, which is, if you're talking about somebody who has kids, that's actually one of the only things we really would like to be able to do is sleep in. And you guys don't get to do that, but you guys get to sleep in and you're not even doing that. So then you compare it to, it's basically a lot of bragging about their ability to consume more than they otherwise would be, whether it be going out to eat at restaurants more or going on trips more. I gotta say to all these people, you really should have kids. The stuff you're consuming is really not that cool. I've been there. I just had my little girl who was born when I was first 36 or something, and it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of parents whining. A lot of the stuff you see in terms of parent social media is parents complaining about having children or the weird things that happen. But in reality, like, the bulk of it is just a lot of fun, and it's a lot. The first 3 months are obviously very hard right after childbirth, and children are very, very needy at that point. But very, very quickly it becomes just a lot of fun in addition to everything else, and very enjoyable. So to the dink couples out there, go have kids. Your grandparents aren't interested in another brunch. They want you to give them grandchildren.
I love that. I saw that video you're talking about, and I chuckled the whole time. But my final thoughts are on the COP28 summit, which is the UN Climate Summit. It's an annual summit, and this year we heard the usual craziness come out from this global regime, including the elimination of all fossil fuels, and unelected bureaucrat John Kerry, who is supposedly the Biden administration's climate czar, was there to call for the elimination as well of all coal plants, because nothing says passing on wealth and health to the next generation, like putting millions of people in climate poverty because they can't heat their homes or otherwise get access to energy. So that was lovely. And of course, what comes out of these summit are typically climate recommendations, but they're often taken as gospel from the elites in this country, who then impose them through their political will on individuals who otherwise don't have power. And of course, corporations adopt these policies as well, and ended up making things a lot more expensive for the average person. But there was one bright spot from COP28, and it was when Pope Francis called out specifically the doomer mentality from climate change activists that the state of the world's weather means that they need to stop having children. So this sort of ties into your topic as well, Will. But he basically said that the idea that the world is overpopulated, the idea that climate change activism or even just preservation of the planet needs to be coupled with a sort of death cult mentality and opposed to life is nonsense. And so I appreciated, despite some of the other things he said about climate change activism that I disagreed with, I thought it was an important message, and I was glad that he was able to share that with those people.
My final thought is, go ahead, Ben. Do you want to go first?
No, you go for it.
My final thought was the passing of Henry Kissinger at age 100. And so obviously a towering figure of American foreign policy, both as a participant and a diplomat, and as a historian and chronicler, both of which he played to the utmost. I think the roles involved obviously a controversial figure, some serious criticism, some completely silly moralizing criticism from the left. I don't think it would have been. I don't think Henry Kissinger was any stranger in life to criticism. I don't think the criticism would have particularly bothered him if he knew about the criticism after his death. As no doubt he knew there would be. That being said, I mean, I think it's an interesting time to consider, especially as conservative foreign policy really seems to be in flux, what the appropriate balance between realpolitik and morality can be had in American foreign policy. Obviously, one of the strongest rebukes to Henry Kissinger was Reagan coming in the final stage of the Cold War, which was not known that it was the final stage of the Cold War, and saying, detente, containment, these are not enough. The Soviet Union is an evil empire, and phrasing America and American foreign policy as obviously just, in addition to pragmatic. And this was this big break with the foreign policy that had been really guided by Henry Kissinger, or at least inspired by Henry Kissinger in many ways. That being said, we now, as Reagan's foreign policy sort of devolved into the Bush foreign policy, something closer to Wilsonianism of making the world over in our image, or bringing democracy to far reaches of the world. I think moralism in foreign policy is definitely on the outs these days in the Republican Party, and I think people are much more sort of interested in a pragmatic and realistic and realpolitik style foreign policy. Trump obviously did govern to a certain extent in that way. I think it's an interesting time to reconsider the role of morality in foreign policy. What ought it to be? Is America the shining city on the hill, and ought our foreign policy somehow to reflect that? Or should we be a hard-headed world power and rule directly sort of in our image and act directly in our national interests without regard to the sort of the moral valence of the regimes we may or may not support or oppose? I think these are questions that are just as relevant as they have been for the last 100 years. So rest in peace to Henry Kissinger for being as fine either an advocate or adversary, depending on what side of the question he was on and you were on, as fine an advocate or adversary as anyone could have ever hoped for.
On an entirely different note, this week it was revealed that the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in the Douglas Mackey case has granted bond pending appeal in that case. Now, you'll recall the Douglas Mackey case concerns this prosecution of troll who went by the handle Ricky Vaughn and put out a tweet which had a satirical meme essentially saying, text your vote for Hillary Clinton to XYZ number around Election Day 2016. As a consequence of that, the DOJ prosecuted Mackey for a conspiracy to violate rights, that he essentially deprive people of their right to vote because they might have wrongly texted their vote to for Hillary Clinton to a phone number, even though the case was never even made really or proven that anyone did not vote as a consequence of texting this number in a clear joke tweet from a troll. And this despite the fact that a left-wing comedian did the same thing in misleading Trump voters about the proper voting day in almost a one-to-one reflection of the Mackey tweet, and was never prosecuted for it. Mackey himself was sentenced to several months in jail. Actually, I think the maximum conviction would have been, I think 10 years potentially behind bars, for essentially tweeting a meme that seriously offended Hillary Clinton, as she actually said in comments down the road. Why is this important that the Second Circuit appears interested in this case? Well, as Mackey characterizes it, this ruling is huge because it means that the appeals court decided that my appeal presents, quote, substantial and, quote, debatable issues of law that, if resolved in my favor, will result in my conviction being vacated. Now, I looked up the judge presiding over the case. I believe this is a Biden-appointed judge. So we should hesitate to expect that actually the Second Circuit may end up vacating this sentence. But nevertheless, it proves that maybe if it isn't taken up by the Second Court and it has to go up to the Supreme Court, that there's an even greater probability that the Supreme Court ultimately will not criminalize those who engage in wrongthink on social media. There's another tangential reason why this case is really important. Donald Trump also, in the January 6th case brought by Jack Smith, is being, one of the charges brought against him is conspiracy to violate rights, just like Mackey. Let's also note that even though it was initially reported, it sort of came to popular prominence in recent days that Jack Smith, the special counsel there, sought, with respect to Donald Trump's Twitter account, information on everyone who retweeted tweets and liked Donald Trump's tweets and sent direct messages and such. To the extent that Donald Trump is convicted for a conspiracy to violate rights by trying to overturn the election, so-called, and by putting forth fraudulent messaging about what happened in the 2020 election, who's to say that the DOJ won't pursue those who retweeted wrongthink from Donald Trump as engaging in a conspiracy against rights? That's one of the reasons, among many other reasons, why this Mackey case is so important, and we'll be keeping an eye on that and reporting on it as it goes through its pendency and ultimately is heard in the courts.
All right. Totally agreed, Ben. And with that, on behalf of Inez, Ben, and Amber, thanks for tuning in. I'm Will Chamberlain, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.